I was a foreign service officer, a career foreign service diplomat. I served actually from one assignment in Korea early on in my career to 6 assignments in Germany. That is in 3 Germanys over the time. And after my foreign service career, which capped with the ambassadorship for Holocaust issues, I went on to the Chicago or DePaul University, and then on to create the Henry Kissinger Professorship or Henry Kissinger Chair at Bonn University here in Germany. It's important, I think, to understand this 20th century as a century of conflict. It begins in the First World War with a war against imperialists, then it moves on to the Second World War with the war against fascists and Nazis, and then beyond that into a Cold War with Soviet communism. And if you look at that stretch of history in the context of what you just suggested, that there are many, many issues. But the core of that is, what were these fights for? What was it all about? It was all about fighting for democracy, fighting for parliamentary democracy, which was achieved in 1990 in Germany, and the unification of Europe that happened. So if you look at the crises that happened, if you look at the historical remembrance, one of the critical issues and very, very much disputed is the Versailles Treaty. In the Versailles Treaty, the United States proposed, President Wilson proposed 14 points, and number 5 of those points is self-determination, a very good concept, but has evolved into ethnic cleansing. It's easier to have self-determination if everybody is ethnically cleansed. That was what Hitler used for what he tried to do. It's a very controversial concept. If it's seen in the context of ethnic cleansing, in political terms, it's a very, very important one. It's very important to remember that the secret of reconciliation is remembrance. And so you're absolutely right to ask the question of how you remember what is important. You can remember in evil ways, such as Milosevic with the Battle of Kosovo from the year 1389 as an excuse for ethnic cleansing and war in Yugoslavia, breakup of Yugoslavia. That's a governmental reaction and a way to remember. That is not a right way to remember, in my view. But there are roles for every kind of issue that you have. Truth and reconciliation, which is tried in South Africa, is a very important way for government and society to deal with historical issues. The Germans have done very well in the addressing the issues of the Holocaust by keeping memorials at concentration camps kept as memorials. The Dora camp, or the V1, V2 rockets of forced labor, is a very important commemoration or remembrance of what happened. Even in the cases of the society, there's an effort here for, as an individual effort, talking about not just governments, but an individual efforts to provide a small, a copper sign or a brass plaque in front of a house from each of those Jews who were in those houses, were what happened to them, what their name was, and what happened to them, whether deported or killed in Auschwitz or fled. So that there's a remembrance that you can see on everywhere you go. And in Berlin, you can see also memorials such as the memorial to the murdered Jews in the middle of the city, recognizing very much what can be done. Museums are very important. And what happens even in daily life, having churches, for instance, having a Jewish, Christian, Muslim dialogue are really very important ways to remember and to work through the differences as well as the similarities of what the oppressed or affected countries are and people. So there are ways that there's a role for society, there's a role for government, there's a role for individuals to deal with these histories. Most important is how you remember. It's the content of what you remember. So if you look at the United States, by contrast, we had a civil war that divided the country, and it was based on slavery. And then in the 1920s and 30s, you had monuments established to the Confederacy, which was a rebellion against democracy in the United States. And now, in the last few years, we've had just the opposite, a remembrance by taking down the monuments that were remembering the rebellion and the fight for slavery as a societal effort. So there are many ways, and there are many ways that people, governments, and NGOs can contribute to remembrance in the way that is possible for reconciliation. The dynamic is very important to see how the history affects decision making today. Germany is a very good example because of the horrible history of the Nazi period. And you can even connect it to the first unification of Germany in 1871 under blood and iron. Then you could see that there is a huge movement not to engage in anything military. And so that has a tremendous effect on the ability of a government to decide whether or not to join in military operations, but also in other operations. It provides an excuse, if you will, not to act. And because the German history says you are so bad, you can't act. I would argue, of course, that the right kind of remembrance is because history was so bad, Germany has an obligation to intervene, particularly in human rights issues, as in they're now about to do in Afghanistan. On the United States side, of course, we had the view that we had the greatest generation, and whatever we did, we could intervene and have done that. And particularly when you get to the Iraq War, a sense that the United States was always doing the right thing. And here in the question of Vietnam comes into the question of how do you make that policy in Iraq. Nevertheless, the United States came down in favor of the war in Iraq, which was a mistake, which is not the right way, but it affects how you make decisions. And now we're faced in the same question of what when we don't have ways to think about and to remember correctly, we begin to look at China today. We look at China and say that in both the United States and in Germany, we talk about the Cold War. This is a deficit of thinking because if you don't have a language of what is going on, you refer back to what you have seen, what you know, what you remember. And by doing that, you have policies that are, as I call them, past their sell-by dates. And it leads you into the wrong kind of policy making. So, for instance, with China, if it were a Cold War, the Cold War was a standoff between two nuclear powers. But China is a power. It's a cooperating power. For instance, on the pandemic and climate. It's of course an economic competitor, and artificial intelligence, and big data, and surveillance, and of course, it is also an adversary, or as the Europeans say, a systemic rival. It is an authoritarian government, and the United States and Europe are democracies. So there's a real conflict there. But you need to get out of the historical remembrance, if you will, recognize what the limits of it, and think about what can be done. Find new language to understand what is happening in modern politics. Well, that's a very interesting question. If you look at two examples, I would give you. One is after the end of the Second World War. Remember, the United States went into the Second World War as a neutral power first, and then Hitler actually declared war on the United States as we declared war on Japan. And in that process, this isolationism and this neutralism was what Americans had defined themselves after the First World War. What happened then was Truman came into power, And there was, as you suggested, a shift. Suddenly, the United States was the eminent power and it had responsibility. Could we assure that we could have peace in the future? And how do we do that? There was a group of 6 wise men who came together, and they said, and Dean Acheson, with his president at the creation, there was a break in American foreign policy, break with the history of isolationism and neutralism and activism, Marshall Plan, deployment to not only the occupation of Germany and Japan, but keeping them there to then promote the idea of democracy. So there was a whole change, a whole shift of the American policy. I'll leave that for a moment and turn to the Germans. The Germans had just the opposite. At the end of the Second World War, they capitulated unconditionally, and like most countries that are defeated, they turn to their victors and look and say, what is it that you have that we don't have? And they were open to democracy. They were open to reassess what their history had been under, particularly not just from Hitler, but with the exception of the Weimar Republic for a short time, from the Kaiser from 1871 on until 1945, they were a military-oriented society from the Prussian tradition. Of course, the result of that was we abolished Prussia, but that didn't necessarily do away with the history of it. But then we are now, in both cases, it's very interesting, both cases in Germany right now, they're at a point of change. There's one that we've argued, and some of us in the transatlantic group here have argued, it is a time for Germany to take the initiative to not let its history become an obstacle to its future, but rather take initiatives on climate, on innovation, on NATO and security issues, on trading issues. They can take initiatives and lead without dominating. This is where they are right now. We'll see the new government has announced itself in the coalition agreement as they use the word Aufbruch, which is a new beginning. And then they talk about the second issue, what all of that underlined is sovereign autonomy is meant to, Macron has proposed, the Germans suggest sovereign, or rather strategic sovereignty. That means making decisions that you can do without thinking through it, which they haven't done for a long time. And also maintaining solidarity with Europe and the United States.